Let me tell you something about the military mind that almost nobody outside of it understands. And most people inside it have never had articulated to them clearly either. The person who serves in the military, who goes through the specific psychological transformation of military training, who operates in combat or in the sustained high-stakes environments that military service creates, who eventually returns to civilian life carrying everything that experience produced, is not simply a civilian who did a dangerous job for a few years. They are a person whose psychology was deliberately, systematically, and profoundly reshaped by one of the most intense social and environmental programs that human beings have ever designed. And the research on what that reshaping actually does, to identity, to cognition, to emotional processing, to the capacity for connection, to the relationship with risk and with mortality, is one of the most important and least publicly understood bodies of work in the psychology of human transformation. Because the cultural conversation about military psychology almost always goes to one of two places: the heroism narrative or the trauma narrative, and both of those are real, and both of them are incomplete. The full psychological picture is more complex, more nuanced, and more important than either narrative captures. That is what we are examining today. Let's start at the beginning, with what military training is actually designed to do psychologically. Because this is the foundational piece, and the one that explains almost everything that follows. Basic training, across military branches and across cultures, is not primarily about teaching physical skills or tactical knowledge. Those things are taught, but they are not the primary psychological purpose. The primary psychological purpose of basic training is identity transformation. The research on organizational socialization and the specific literature on military training as an extreme form of that process identifies a deliberate three-stage transformation: unfreezing the existing identity, reshaping it according to the requirements of the military role, and refreezing the new identity in ways that make it stable and automatic under conditions of extreme stress. The unfreezing stage is what most people recognize from films and documentaries: the stripping away of individual identity markers, the uniform clothing, the shaved head, the removal of personal names replaced by rank and last name, the deliberate disruption of the sleep, the diet, the routine, and the social environment of the recruit, the elimination of the individual identity so that the collective military identity can be built in its place. David Grossman's research on the psychology of killing and military training, and the broader research on moral disengagement in military context, documents what this process is designed to produce. Not the elimination of the individual, the transformation of the individual's relationship with authority, with collective identity, with the specific situations that military service requires navigating. The research on identity fusion, developed by William Swan and colleagues, is directly relevant. Military training produces one of the most complete examples of identity fusion in human experience: the merging of personal identity with group identity in ways that produce a willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for the group that no other socialization process reliably generates. Here is the cognitive picture, because the military environment does not just transform identity. It transforms how the mind processes information under pressure. The research on expert performance under stress and the specific literature on how military training reshapes stress responses documents something that is counterintuitive from the outside: the experience of repeated controlled exposure to extreme stress, which is what military training is designed to provide, does not simply make people more comfortable with stress in the generic sense. It produces a specific and measurable recalibration of the stress response system. Dave Grossman's research on combat and its psychological effects, and the subsequent neuroscience research on trained versus untrained responses to threat, found that military training produces what researchers call stress inoculation. The repeated exposure to controlled high-stress situations builds a more calibrated relationship between the physiological stress response and the cognitive performance it is supposed to support. In untrained individuals, acute stress, the cortisol and adrenaline cascade of the fight-flight-freeze response, produces a specific pattern of cognitive narrowing. Tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, the focusing of all available cognitive resources on the immediate threat at the expense of broader situational awareness and complex decision-making. In trained military personnel, the same physiological response is present, but its cognitive consequences are different. The training has built neural pathways through repetition of decision-making and action sequences under progressively more stressful conditions that allow trained performance to proceed even when the physiological stress response is fully activated. This is what military people mean when they talk about training taking over. It is not a metaphor, it is the literal neurological consequence of having rehearsed specific response sequences so many times that they have become available below the threshold of conscious deliberation. When the stress response narrows conscious cognitive capacity, the trained automatic response is still there. Now let me talk about the social psychology. Because the military creates social bonds that the research on group cohesion identifies as among the most powerful human beings are capable of forming. The conditions of military service, particularly combat service, produce what Sebastian Junger, in his research on tribal psychology, calls the conditions most associated with the deepest human social bonding: genuine shared risk, genuine mutual dependence, the specific experience of having another person's life depend on your performance, and vice versa. Jonathan Haidt's research on moral elevation and the psychology of self-transcendence is relevant here. The military context creates consistent opportunities for what Haidt calls the hive switch, the deactivation of individual self-interest and the activation of collective identity that produces the specific experience of feeling part of something larger than the self. The research on social bonding under conditions of shared adversity and the specific literature on combat unit cohesion finds that the bonds formed in these conditions are qualitatively different from the bonds formed in ordinary social contexts. Not just stronger in intensity, different in structure, built on a foundation of mutual dependence and shared mortality that civilian relationships almost never provide. This is the source of one of the most consistent and most poignant findings in the psychology of military veterans: the difficulty of replicating in civilian life the quality of connection that military service provided, not because civilian relationships are less genuine, but because the specific conditions that produce the military bond, the shared risk, the mutual dependence, the collective purpose operating under genuine threat, are not available in the same form. Here is where the psychology of military service becomes most important and most urgent. The transition back. The research on reintegration, on what happens psychologically when a person who has been through the specific transformation of military service returns to civilian life, is one of the most clinically significant and least adequately addressed areas in the psychology of military people. Because the transition is not simply a matter of leaving one job and starting another, it is the requirement to reverse, or more accurately, to somehow manage the psychological transformation that military training and service produced. The identity that was built for the military environment, that was shaped by the specific demands of military service, the chain of command, the collective identity, the relationship with risk and with mortality, does not automatically reconstitute itself as a civilian identity when the uniform comes off. The research on veteran reintegration identifies several specific transition challenges that are not about pathology. They are about the mismatch between the psychological profile that military service develops and the psychological requirements of civilian life. The military environment rewards certainty, hierarchy, decisive action, and the suppression of individual emotional processing in favor of mission focus. The civilian environment rewards ambiguity tolerance, lateral relationship navigation, deliberative decision-making, and emotional expressiveness. These are not small differences. They are differences in the fundamental operating assumptions of two distinct social environments. And the person who has spent years, sometimes decades, developing the psychological profile that military service requires is now being asked to navigate a world that is organized around almost opposite requirements. Let me talk about post-traumatic stress specifically, because it is the most discussed aspect of military psychology and the one where the research has produced the most important and least popularized findings. The prevalence of PTSD in combat veterans is real and significant. Research by the Veterans Administration and independent research groups consistently finds elevated rates of PTSD in combat-exposed veterans compared to the general population. Estimates vary by conflict, by deployment intensity, and by the specific nature of combat exposure, but the elevated risk is consistent across the research. What is less consistently communicated in the public conversation is what PTSD actually is at the neurological and psychological level, and what this tells us about who is most vulnerable and why. Jonathan Shea's foundational work on moral injury and the distinction he draws between PTSD as a fear-based response to life threat and moral injury as a wound to the moral conscience produced by betrayal of what is right is among the most important contributions to the clinical understanding of military psychological injury. Moral injury, the specific psychological damage produced by participating in or witnessing events that violate deeply held moral beliefs, is not the same as PTSD and does not respond to the same treatments. The veteran who carries moral injury is not primarily struggling with hyperarousal and intrusive memories of mortal threat. They are struggling with the specific experience of having acted or having been ordered to act in ways that their own moral framework cannot accommodate. The research on moral injury in military populations is one of the most important and least publicly understood areas of military psychology, and its clinical implications are significant. The treatments most effective for fear-based PTSD are not necessarily the treatments most effective for moral injury, and misidentifying one as the other produces treatment failures that the research increasingly recognizes as preventable. Here is something the research identifies about military people that almost never makes it into the public conversation: post-traumatic growth. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun's foundational research on post-traumatic growth and the subsequent literature applying this framework to military populations finds something that the trauma narrative about military service consistently underemphasizes. A significant proportion of veterans report not just surviving their military experience, but being genuinely and positively transformed by it. Increased personal strength, deeper relationships, a changed sense of what matters, a relationship with mortality that has produced a quality of presence and appreciation for life that they did not have before. This does not minimize the genuine psychological injury that military service produces in others. Both things are true simultaneously and in the same population. Some veterans carry devastating psychological wounds. Others carry genuine growth. Many carry both. The research on what predicts post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic disorder in military populations identifies several factors: the quality of social support during and after service, the degree to which the veteran is able to construct a meaningful narrative around their experience, the presence of genuine community, both within veteran networks and in civilian life, that can receive and validate the complexity of what they have been through. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of military people is not a single story. It is not the heroism narrative. It is not the trauma narrative. It is not the stereotype in any of its forms. The stoic warrior, the broken veteran, the dangerous outsider, the selfless patriot. It is the story of a specific psychological transformation, deliberate, profound, and in many ways irreversible, that produces a specific kind of person. One whose relationship with identity, with community, with risk, with mortality, and with the capacity for connection has been shaped by experiences that most people in civilian life never encounter and cannot fully understand from the outside. The research on military psychology is ultimately the research on what happens when human beings are placed in the most extreme conditions the human social world produces. What it does to the identity, what it does to the capacity for connection, what it costs, what it builds, and what happens when the person carrying all of that has to find their way back into a world that has no adequate framework for receiving it. Military people are not a different species. They are human beings whose psychology has been shaped by specific experiences in specific ways. Understanding those ways, honestly, with the full complexity that the research documents, is the beginning of understanding them, not as heroes, not as casualties, as people whose experience deserves to be understood in its full psychological reality, and who deserve more than the stories we have been telling about them.